Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we talk about the excuse of settler violence. Let's get started. Many of us have heard the term settler violence. It's in the news repeatedly, it's all over social media, it's sort of the new buzzword of 2024 and 2025. But this isn't really a new phenomenon. We've been hearing about quote-unquote settlements and settlers for a very long time. And as is the case with most things that are fake Palestinian stories, they tend to get a little old and boring and people stop listening. So they constantly have to adapt and change and make things sound worse than they used to get people's attention. People stopped caring about quote-unquote the settlements, but now we talk about settler violence, and all of a sudden people are listening again. And I hate to admit, but it's clearly working, considering how much we're hearing about it on the news and on social media these days. It is the new go-to for the pro-Pali anti-Israel groups to bring up settler violence. And not to bury the lead here, I just want to point out the irony in the fact that they love to use this settler violence specifically because they want to turn away from the realities in Gaza. We all know Hamas rules Gaza, Hamas is terrible. They're having difficulties defending that. So now they're moving on to, quote, settler violence because they pretend that Hamas isn't in the West Bank. What's your excuse, Israel, for having settler violence and the problems happening in the West Bank when Hamas isn't there? Unfortunately for them, Hamas is very much there and is very much behind this violence. For any of our new listeners who maybe haven't heard some of our older episodes, you can go back and listen to a few of our old episodes to get a little bit more background on the topic of settlements and settlers. Episode 64, called What is a Settlement, will go a little bit into what they call settlements today, and it's a little misleading, and we'll get to that a little bit in this podcast. And episode 104, Who is Occupying Who, talks about the legality of whose land it really belongs to, which is very important when you're talking about supposed settlers, a settler being someone who doesn't belong there, a colonizer, if you will. And for anybody who's listened to this podcast before, they know that settler is not a great definition to use for Jewish people in what we now call the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Not to go over old stuff that we've talked about on previous podcasts. Again, after this podcast, you can go back and get more of a detailed history of the region and the whole situation with settlements. But let's just start at the Oslo Accords, because this is vital for the term settlement. Again, settlement suggesting someone illegally taking a place that doesn't belong to them. In the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority, at that time Fatah or the PLO, along with the United States and Israel, came to an agreement for what we now know as the Oslo Accord. The Oslo Accord was intended to create the first steps towards a Palestinian Arab state. Just to be sure, that would be the second Palestinian Arab state, considering Jordan already is a Palestinian Arab state. But let's leave that aside. The stepping stone would create 3 zones. And we've talked about this on previous podcasts, why we have 3 zones. One would be under full control of a Palestinian government. The second one would be under control of the Palestinian government civilly and security-wise, both parties. And then Area C would be under Israeli control. The idea would be, hopefully, to eventually come up with final borders once it is proven that the Palestinian Authority government that was just created and their security forces would be able to maintain some type of safety and security and working together with Israel and the Palestinian government to have 2 separate states. And not surprisingly, the PLO, Fatah, became the Palestinian Authority. They agreed, they signed on the dotted line. It was Yasser Arafat himself that agreed to this for the Palestinian Arab people. So once it was signed, they became a government, they got security forces, and they got Area A for themselves, Area B for themselves, with Israeli security help, and then Area C was agreed to by the Palestinian Arabs to be controlled by Israel. And as part of that deal, in Area C, under Israeli control, the Israelis were allowed to build and expand their areas that Jews were living, today known as settlements to people who are a little uneducated about the topic. So the idea of a settlement suggesting illegality isn't really fitting with the fact that the Palestinian Arabs agreed that the Jewish people in Area C could build their homes and expand their towns, and it wasn't against the rules. It wasn't against the laws. And you'll hear about this idea of settlements and settlers and all this stuff constantly on media, ignoring the facts and reality. Even the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian supporters themselves ignore Oslo. They want to keep everything that works for them in Oslo, being a security force, a government, autonomy, all of those amazing things they love, but they want to throw out the parts that they don't agree with now. That's not how accords and agreements work. You can't just say 30 or 40 years later, you know what, we don't like the deal, we're just going to ignore the parts we don't like. Illegal settlements, or settlers, is an incredibly biased term for people who live in an area that the Palestinian Arabs themselves agreed would be Jewish land. Thinking about the fact that settlements and settlers is an incredibly biased and not accurate term, we can put that aside for a minute to talk about the violence aspect. And let me just begin this part by suggesting that violence is wrong for anybody and everybody. When there's violence, Jew against Arab, Arab against Jew, it is all bad, and I condemn all of it. It shouldn't happen. With that said, we can go into the history of this situation in order to really see what's going on here and if the terms are correct. Not that it's justification, but to understand why this is being presented the way it is. So if we look at the history I just mentioned before, the fact that Area C is under Israeli control, agreed to by the Palestinian authorities, and it does have some Palestinian Arabs, or people who now call themselves Palestinian Arabs, living in that area. As I had said, the Israelis, or the IDF, has the responsibility of keeping people safe in Area C. So they have soldiers there, they try to do the best they can to keep peace, but there are incidents of violence, as is the case in literally every other country or area around the world. Police aren't perfect, crime still does happen, and it is unfortunate that the people who live in Area C, the Jewish people, have spent many, many, many years being attacked by their neighbors from Area B and people coming from Area A. We've had murders of people in their cars. We've had people burnt in their cars. We've had people getting shot, whole families being killed. It is a problem. And vice versa, it is also a big problem that the people who live in Area C, known in mass media as settlers, will sometimes become incredibly frustrated at the fact that the government isn't doing enough to protect them. There could be many reasons why this is the case. International pressure for the Israelis not to do anything that could be seen as wrong in Area C, or being too oppressive to the Palestinian Arabs in that area, and therefore they don't police enough. But the reason why these Israeli people are getting so frustrated is because people are dying from terrorism, and the police are not doing enough. And so, unfortunately, what happens when people are not feeling protected, they tend to try to protect themselves. And I admit, sometimes it goes too far. Sometimes they will go into a neighboring town, an Arab village, and they might burn cars, they might destroy homes, they might cause damage, they might even harm people. And that is absolutely wrong. It shouldn't be the case. But the problem with the way that it's being presented is no one is mentioning the Palestinian Arabs in that area who are doing the violence that might lead to some type of retribution. And it is presented simply as people who don't belong here, i.e. settlers, attacking the people who do belong here, who are peaceful and all they want to do is live their lives. And for some reason, these random Jewish people are just killing everybody. This is the media spin that they are trying to use to suggest, see how Israel acts in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria area? That's why they're also wrong in Gaza. First of all, they have literally nothing to do with one another. And second of all, if you leave out the bad stuff, which they've been trying to do in Gaza also, like Hamas doesn't exist, and the Palestinian Arabs who commit the crimes that then cause a retribution also doesn't exist, then no wonder the Jews are always bad. Settler violence, the IDF in Gaza, Jews are always wrong. Pretty easy when you think about mainstream media storylines here. Just blame the Jews. And just to nip this talking point in the bud, which you hear usually a lot on social media and whatever, about how Israeli settlers are stealing land, let's be incredibly clear with this. We'll go into why it's not stealing in a minute. But even if you pretend that the Palestinian Arabs owned all of this land, the Jewish people who are in that area, Area C, which are legally allowed to build there, assuming they get permits from the government, have purchased that land legally. For many of you who might not have seen the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, it is massively empty. There are towns and stuff scattered all over the place. Don't get me wrong, it's not literally empty, but it's not like they're New York City, where the only way to build a house is by ripping down your neighbor's house because there's no extra room. It is vast land that is empty. But any home built, no matter where it is, to people on the opposite side of this argument, is automatically stealing the land, even if they have receipts for the purchase. So as you can see, the idea of a Jewish settler in the land is on itself ridiculous because of the history and because of the Oslo Accord that allows them to be there. We also see the fact that the land is not being stolen from anybody. But then we also can see how the settler violence is being presented as such a terrible stain on the genocidal Israelis who are just trying to kill Palestinian Arabs. It is a complete false narrative. Sure, violence happens. Absolutely it happens. But the idea to suggest that the Palestinian Arabs are completely blameless in this issue, and not only that, they're justified in doing it because the Jews are stealing their land anyway. So wouldn't you do this if they stole your land? And one really funny talking point that they use all the time that makes me laugh every time they use it, and it's funny when they get put in their place when they try and use it, is this idea that what would you do if someone came into your home, said, "This is my home now," and then took your home and kicked you out? Wouldn't you do violence against them like the Palestinian Arabs do? Isn't it justified to attack a person who stole your home? Completely a terrible example because, technically speaking, it was the Jewish people's home, and the Palestinian Arabs, who didn't call themselves Palestinian Arabs until the 1960s, technically stole the land. So, if anything, their example proves themselves to be completely backwards and wrong. And this gets us a little bit into the actual international law aspect of this whole problem. We have heard so many times people use the UN and Amnesty International and various other groups that we all now know are completely biased, claiming they deem it to be occupied Palestinian territories. They deem it to be an apartheid area. So therefore, that's what it is. And it gives people credibility to say that this is settler land and you're not supposed to be here. Look, the UN even says it. But what is really sad, despite the fact that people take the UN at its word, even though they are currently helping Hamas in Gaza right now under the UNRWA banner, leaving that aside, international law is incredibly clear about this. And we've talked about this before on the podcast. Israel received the land in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria from an occupying force known as Jordan in 1967 following a defensive war. The war that was started by the Jordanians against Israel, they lost, and Israel gained control of this territory. So even if we pretend that the Oslo Accord means nothing, we don't accept it, we're throwing it in the garbage, the land of Judea and Samaria was Jewish land prior to the Arab conquest, but also was land received in a defensive war, which under international law suggests that it now belongs to the person who was defending themselves. Under international law, you cannot take land or acquire land through aggressive and violent means, i.e., starting a war. When someone starts a war against you, you are 100% allowed to defend yourself. And in that defense, if they lose land, it does not necessarily have to be given back to them. Israel did, in fact, try and give the land back to Jordan, who refused it. That's a whole other story. But Israel's right to that land, historically speaking, and speaking from international law point of view, is Israeli land. Now, Israel is honoring the Oslo Accord, so they have signed on the dotted line to give Area A to the Palestinian Arabs and Area B to the Palestinian Arab government in conjunction with the IDF for security reasons. And so Israel accepts that that area is now Palestinian Authority area. Whereas, for whatever reason, the Palestinian Arabs and their supporters choose to ignore all of Oslo Accords. But those accords supersede the fact that in 1967, Israel legally took that land in a defensive war, and it is historically Jewish land. And if we go back even further, it was promised to the Jews in 1917 by the British, and it was supposed to be the state of Israel until Jordan occupied it in an illegal war. In the end, when we talk about settler violence, it is an absolutely fictional, made-up talking point. It is a way for them to try and take away the responsibility of the Palestinian Arabs, the people in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and the violence that they are causing, which then leads to other violence back. And again, I'm not suggesting that it's only the Palestinian Arabs' fault. The Jewish people, as I've said on this podcast before, should be better than this. But I do understand why it's happening, even though if it's not a justification. It is an absolute cycle of violence that needs to stop. And I'll be honest, the only way for this to stop is to come up with whatever the solution is to the Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Arab, Israeli crisis. Whether you subscribe to a two-state solution or a one hybrid state solution with both peoples having representation, whatever it might be, that is the way to solve the issue. And the problem's been that since 1990s, the Palestinian Authority has not moved forward at all on any type of peace. Since the Oslo Accords, there have been multiple peace deals that have been offered by the Israeli government, up to and including giving them 98% of the West Bank or Judea and Samaria for themselves. That would be their state. They would have borders. That would be the end of the conflict. There's no more from the river to the sea, and there's no more violence. But the problem is they have never been willing to make that deal because they only want from the river to the sea. There is no middle ground here. And that's why the violence on both sides keeps happening. That cycle of violence. Imagine we were able to do a little thought experiment here. The Jewish people, who are indigenous by all historical records, decide to build homes in their indigenous homeland. That would be considered, apparently, settlements. If we change that to, let's say, the First Nations of America, and they put up a home in an area that they live, what they used to call reservations, if they were to build a home there, would it be called a settlement? Would they be deemed settlers? It's pretty funny because there have been many occasions of First Nations trying to stand up for their indigenous rights, clean water, electricity, better treatment, whatever it might be. And sometimes they have been extremely violent towards people while they're protesting. Yet not a single person in the mainstream media or around the world ever called them settlers committing violence. When an indigenous people try to assert their rights in their own land, it is not deemed settler violence. But for some reason, when the Jewish indigenous people try and assert their rights in their own homeland, somehow it is deemed to be settler violence and settler colonialism. And if we think about this the other way around, whereas right now we have the state of Israel within the state of Israel's borders, the Palestinian Arabs who claim that they want from the river to the sea, even though they are not technically indigenous, not original owners of the land, they do have some claim to the land, no doubt. So when they say that they want from the river to the sea, if that Palestinian Arab who lives right now in Lebanon or Jordan wants the right of return to go back to, let's say, Yafo, next to Tel Aviv, or in Tel Aviv itself, are they settlers? It's funny how people's perception will justify what they already believe. If I believe the Palestinian Arabs are indigenous and this entire land belongs to them, they can put a house anywhere within the borders of Israel, and it is absolutely not settlements. But if the Jewish people are indigenous to the land and want to put houses in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, legally, by the way, it is settlements. The hypocrisy is off the charts. And luckily for the people who would say these kind of stupid things, they actually are too stupid to realize the contradiction in their own thinking. If you believe that a Palestinian person who's indigenous to the land should be able to rebuild homes anywhere within Israel, and that is not a settlement, then why is it that if you believe the Jewish people are indigenous to the land, they too don't have the same exact right without it being called a settlement? So the next time you hear this term settler violence, just remember how inaccurate that statement is. Neither are they settlers, nor are they the ones necessarily creating the violence. It is a cycle. And the Palestinian Arabs are not free of blame for that cycle and their part in it. It is no different than anywhere else in the world. The only difference is the perception that the world seems to want to present that Israel is bad and stealing land and killing people, and the Palestinian Arabs are completely blameless, indigenous people who can put their homes anywhere they want and be as violent as they want without any blame whatsoever. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.